These are 24-inch corner shelves I built for my garage. I needed some more storage space, but I didn't want to take up much room, so I took advantage of the corners of the garage to maximize my storage capacity. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can build your own with some basic DIY skills and just one trip to the home improvement store, as long as you don't forget anything like I always do. But before I get started, I just wanted to mention this video is intended for those with beginner to intermediate home improvement skills. So as I go through each step, keep in mind I'm trying to keep it as easy to understand as possible. There are probably quicker and maybe even better ways to do some of these things if you're a pro. But today is all about keeping it simple for your weekend DIYer. That being said, let's talk about the design first. I am building 3 shelves, and each shelf will go 24 inches onto each wall in the corner. If you have more or less space, feel free to adjust your measurements accordingly. First, you'll build a triangle out of 2x3s that will be mounted to the wall, as you can see here in green. Then you'll cut a piece of plywood that you see in blue. The plywood is going to hang over the edges of the triangle, as you can see in orange. Each shelf is going to require the following lumber: a 2-foot by 2-foot piece of plywood, and about 78 inches of 2x3s. So we'll start with a trip to the home improvement store to buy materials. Plywood at my store comes in 4x8 sheets or in 2x4 foot pieces. The cost to get 2x4 pieces is actually about the same as getting a full 4x8 sheet, and I want to use other parts of the 4x8 sheet for some other shelves I'm going to build. So I'm buying the full 4x8 sheet. I went with 3/4 inch thick red oak. Personally, I recommend the 3/4 inch thick plywood because it's going to stay sturdy even with a good amount of weight on it. If you're on a budget, you could go cheaper here if you want. While I was at the home center, I also had them cut my 4x8 sheet into 2x2 squares to make it easier to transport in my car. Then I also went and picked up some 2x3s for the shelf supports. Plus, you're going to need to pick up some construction screws. Don't use drywall screws because they don't provide the strength you want. I bought these, but if I was going to do it again, I probably would have bought 3-inch screws to get the screws a little bit deeper into the studs. So now that you have your lumber, it's time for the fun to begin. The first thing you should do is measure the corner that you're building in and find your studs. I used a combination of a stud finder and some rare earth magnets. Find where your studs are running and mark off where you want to be screwing those supports into the wall. You want to find at least 2 different studs to anchor each piece of wood into. So once I have my stud locations marked with a pencil, I like to use a small drill bit first, just to make sure that I found the stud properly, because stud finders aren't perfect, and you can see how I missed the studs several times here. Next, it's time to cut your first piece of wood. Measure 24 inches and make a 90-degree cut. While you're at it, do a second piece that's 24 inches long. Now it's time to cut the angle, or the miter. So adjust your saw to cut at a 45-degree angle. And now mark your lumber for the angle it's going to be cut at, then flip it over and make the marks going in the same directions. When I make a pencil mark on my lumber, I'm just making it directionally to remind myself which way the miter is supposed to go. This line is not meant to be the cut line. You're cutting in at a 45-degree angle in one direction and then negative 45 degrees on the other side. So the resulting piece of wood should be like a trapezoid, kind of like this. The long end should still be 24 inches because you're cutting from the very end of the piece to make your miter. And you want to do the exact same thing for the second 24-inch piece. Now I want to fit these onto the wall. So get your level out and make sure that the 2x3 is level. Find the first stud you're going to drill into and make sure that you have the right size drill bit for the job. Look for a bit that's about the diameter of the screw. Drill your first hole and then drive the screw into the hole. I'm driving my screws using an impact driver, and I'm driving them a little bit deeper than the surface of the wood, just to make sure that I'm hitting a good amount of the stud inside of the wall. Then drive a second screw in that spot. Next, you want to move to your next stud and then drive at least one screw there. You can see that my stud is buried pretty deep into this corner, so I need to drill and drive that screw at a little bit of an angle. It's harder to do, but you want to make sure that you're drilling into your studs, because that's what's going to give you your support. Then repeat for the next piece of wood. Check it for level, not just on the piece of wood you're hanging, but also run the level across both pieces of wood at a diagonal to make sure you're level in that direction too. And now it's time to cut the diagonal piece of wood. It's going to be roughly 29 3/4 inches if you're doing 24-inch sides, but you want to measure it first just to make sure. Then mark your miters onto the wood. Both of these will also be 45-degree angles that you're cutting. So when you're cutting the miters, cut the wood a fraction of an inch longer than your measurement, because it's always easy to go back and trim off a little bit if needed. But if you cut the wood too short, you can't press Ctrl-Z to undo it. Once you have the wood cut, drill your holes and attach it, checking for level on this piece of wood as well as across the other pieces. Now it's time to repeat the process for your next shelves. Figure out how much spacing you want between your shelves and mark that off on the wall. Don't forget to add 3/4 inches for the thickness of the plywood that's going to be on the finished shelf. Okay, so once you're done with all your triangles, now it's time to prep the plywood. I'm starting off with 24-inch by 24-inch squares. If you haven't already, cut your plywood into that size. Also, I designed my shelves to have a little overhang over that cross brace. If you just made the wood triangular, going to the length of the cross brace, you'd lose a lot of space. But obviously you can't make the shelf square because then there's nothing under that fourth corner to support it. So I went for a minor overhang. It should still keep the integrity of the shelf and not sag, but it's going to give me some extra space on the shelf. I marked off 15 inches from each corner. Then I drew a line connecting those 2 points. I'm going to cut that corner off the square with a jigsaw. But just to give these shelves a more streamlined look, I'm going to add a minor detail. Take the bottom of a 1-gallon paint can and trace the curvature of the can. Now cut on that line, and it's going to add a nice little detail to your shelving. Next, it's time to sand. I sanded the edges with 100 grit sandpaper to take off the roughness from the cuts, especially on those curves. I also did a quick sanding of the shelf surface. It was already pretty smooth, but it can't hurt to hit it quickly to smooth it out a little bit more. So now you need to decide if you're going to paint your shelves or not. If no, skip the next steps and go straight to final assembly. You could paint your triangles that are already mounted on the wall, but I decided that I wanted to do a neater job, so I'm going to take them off the wall for some light sanding and painting first. So you're probably wondering why I didn't sand and paint them before I put them up in the first place. You know, I thought about it, but I really wanted to dry fit the triangles to the wall, because remember that no wall is perfectly 90 degrees in the corner. And because I am not a pro where my cuts are down to the millimeter, I want to make sure that I got it right. So personally, I felt like it was worth the extra few minutes to mount the triangles to the wall and then take them back down for painting later. So I disassembled the triangles, marking the pieces. I made them 1A, 1B, 1C for the first shelf, 2A, 2B, etc. as I went along. Then I did a quick sanding to take off any major roughness. I really didn't care about making these perfectly smooth because you really won't see them or you won't touch them too much. So now it's time to prime and paint. I spread a drop cloth and I'm using other scrap pieces of wood to hold up my 2x3s. For the plywood, I used these plastic painter's pyramids to keep the wood suspended off the drop cloth and to minimize the mess. I decided to use an oil-based primer because I hate myself. Just kidding, it works really well, but oil-based primer is always messier to clean up. Honestly, the reason I used oil-based here is just because I had some laying around. But use whatever primer you want. From past experience, I've found that using a dedicated primer is going to give you the best possible coverage over bare wood. So I used 1 coat of primer here. Next, it's time for some paint. I'm using Sherwin-Williams Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel. I have a painter friend who recommended this stuff to me, and he says it is tough as nails. However, the downside is that it is super expensive, even after a 40% discount. So I heard that Behr also has a urethane enamel that would probably work well. Or, I mean, really use whatever latex paint you're comfortable with. I don't care, they're your shelves. Okay, so now the painting is done and it's time to put everything back together. Hopefully you labeled each piece of your 2x3 triangle so you can reassemble it quickly using the same screw holes. And now your last step is to put the plywood on there and screw it down. I used 1 1/4 inch screws to screw it down. Drill 4 holes and put them along the perimeter of each shelf, going down into the triangles. And for some final details, I used latex caulk on the edges. Then I did a quick touch-up to paint the screws and the caulk so everything blends together. And that, my friends, is how I built my garage corner shelves. I hope you enjoyed this video.